Kevin, thanks so much for joining us. Can you sum up the debate we heard on Thursday over education funding?
I think what you heard was a real debate about the state of education in Idaho and how does money fit into that equation. You heard a lot of pushback from legislators saying, hey, wait a minute, we have put quite a bit of money into education over the past couple of years, and that's true. And on top of that, the federal government has put a lot of money into education. As Wendy Horman, Representative Wendy Horman pointed out in her floor debate, the feds have put a boatload of money. Boatload was a word we heard at least once during the session on Thursday. The feds have put so much money into education, most of which has been unspent, most of which the school districts are still sitting on because they have a couple of years to spend. There is a lot of money flowing. And what you heard on Thursday was a debate about what will we get with the additional money? Where will the additional money go? How do we measure success? How do we know on the other side of this that the money that we've committed on Thursday, how do we know that it's getting results?
To be clear, we don't know that right now, do we?
We don't know how that's going to be measured. We don't really know where the money's going to go. That was not debated on Thursday. That's not really contemplated in the bill. That's going to all be settled out in the appropriations process starting in January with a whole new crop of legislators.
As of right now, with that investment, we don't know yet how much control school districts will have over that funding, correct?
Exactly. And I think if you went to 115 different school districts, you'd probably get 115 different answers about what the top priority is. But some themes are definitely emerging. A lot of school districts talking about the need to hire, the need to retain, not just teachers, but classified staff. You know, your school bus drivers, your cafeteria workers, folks who are going to get more money if they take a job at a fast food restaurant than they can get at their local school district. Rob Sauer, the superintendent in Homedale, was one of the folks who testified on Thursday, and he said pretty much that. He said, we can't compete with McDonald's to get classified employees in. Think about that for a moment. A school district cannot compete with a burger joint to get employees. So that's a big priority for a lot of school districts. Facilities is a big priority for districts, and you're hearing a lot more sentiment from the school community, from the education community, saying this system of paying for schools through local property taxes and bond issues, it's just not working. We're not keeping up with growth. We're not keeping up with deferred maintenance. We're just falling behind, and it's going to get worse.
Since you brought that up, this came 2 days after school bond and levy elections across the state. How did those elections go for schools?
Not very well, not in the big districts with the big ticket proposals. Coeur d'Alene had an $80 million plant facilities levy. It received a slim majority, but it needed a 55% threshold to pass. Valley View, Middleton, two growing districts in Canyon County, had bond issues, both failed. Valley Views came very, very close to that 2/3 supermajority. You know, this is something that we're seeing play out in a lot of school districts, and we saw it play out a little bit in the debate on Thursday. One of the most compelling pieces of testimony we heard in the joint public hearing on Thursday morning, it came from a teacher in the Valley View School District who said, you know, I love teaching, I love this profession, I would hate to leave it, I just don't know if this is where my future is. And she said, you know, part of what makes me wonder about the future of being in the classroom is what happened at the polls on Tuesday in her district when voters did not approve a bond issue for new schools.
A lot of the testimony opposed to the school funding provision of this bill, a lot of that opposition focused on outcomes, that student outcomes haven't necessarily improved much after all of the investments over the years that you mentioned. What metrics are they looking at?
I think if you look at any metric right now, there are challenges, and not unexpected challenges given what's happened in the world over the past 2 years. But if you look at reading scores, if you look at scores on the ISAT, the standardized test that the kids take from 3rd grade on into high school, if you look at the college go-on rate, all of these metrics are not where people want them to be, where education leaders want them to be. And I think you're going to see that debate continue, and that debate should continue. I mean, I think it's fair for anybody to say, if we're putting this much money into education, there has to be a return on this investment. That's only fair. And I go back to Kurt Liebeck, the president of the state board, spoke to school administrators about a month ago. I listened to his address to them, and he put it right on the line with them. He said, we're putting all this money into literacy. We're putting all this money into reading. You have to show us something that we can take back to the legislature. You have to improve these reading scores. Not just because, obviously, it helps kids. It helps them the rest of their way in their academic careers, but it helps the state board make the case to the legislature that if you put money into education, you get results. And I don't think the administrators were, I think the administrators get that. I think they understand that that's part of the bargain. But Scott Wolstenholme, the superintendent in Bonneville, came back and said, you do have to give us some time, I mean, we can't just put the money in and expect results right away. It takes some time to get results. They're both right. They're both making a valid point here. But I think this debate over accountability, over results on return on investment, that's just beginning. And I think that's a healthy debate. And I think that's a healthy discussion.
We also heard a lot about Proposition 1, the Quality Education Act, on Thursday and in the lead up to the special session. How does this piece of legislation play with Proposition 1?
Well, that's going to be really interesting to see because, for the record, Proposition 1 is still going to be on the ballot in November alongside this loaded question of an advisory question about this special session. Both of those questions are going to be on the ballot before voters. In effect, what happened on Thursday preempts Proposition 1. If Proposition 1 passes, the income tax increases contemplated in the initiative would be overturned by this new law 2 days later. So this definitely preempts Proposition 1. And, look, if you think that there's no connection between what we saw on Thursday and the fact that Proposition 1 was on the ballot, you really need to come back to reality and check out what's going on here, because obviously there was a connection. Obviously Governor Little came up with the $330 million figure for K-12 in response to the $330 million that Reclaim Idaho was hoping to get from its initiative. So Reclaim Idaho's initiative will still be on the ballot, but as I read Luke Mayville's statement, the co-founder from Reclaim, after the special session, he was proclaiming victory. He said, we would not have gotten to this point with this legislature if Reclaim had not gotten its initiative on the ballot. As he put it, $410 million of new money for education. A couple of years ago, that would have been an extreme proposal. On Thursday, it was a mainstream proposal. It was the compromise, and it prevailed.
That advisory question that's going to be on the ballot at the same time as Proposition 1 doesn't actually affect policy. It's, for all intents and purposes, a fancy poll.
It's not even a fancy poll. I mean, it's a push poll. It's Governor Little and the legislature wanting an attaboy from voters. I mean, it is so, the wording is so blatantly worded in favor of this. I mean, if you vote against it, you feel like you're voting against mom and apple pie here.
The question's wording is basically, do you like education funding while also getting tax rebates and no increases in taxes for anybody?
You could have done the advisory question a lot quicker by just saying, was this a great special session or the greatest special session? Because it is that loaded. But it'll be on the ballot, and if it's like the advisory question we saw in 2006, when then Governor Jim Risch did his special session, it will fly. It will, Risch's advisory question carried every precinct in the state, as Risch loves to point out when people talk about his special session from 16 years ago.
I want to talk about that special session a little bit because there were echoes of the 2006 special session during this week's special session. Remind us, what did the legislature do in 2006?
Okay, so in 2006, in a one-day session, what legislators did was they overhauled the way schools fund themselves. What they did, and they took $260 million off of the property tax rolls. Property tax money that was coming in a steady stream year to year, very predictable funding source for schools. But at a time in 2006, not unlike 2022, when there was a lot of outcry over property taxes, a lot of demand for property tax reform. So this is why you saw legislators rally behind Risch's proposal, which took this $260 million of school funding off of the property tax, put most of it on the sales tax. That's when we went from a 5% sales tax rate to a 6% rate, with the idea that the sales tax would cover most of the difference. Well, what a lot of critics were cautioning about. And full disclosure, we were skeptics on the Idaho Statesman editorial board back in the day, and we wrote editorials saying, you know, we're not sure this is going to work, and we're not sure this is going to work when and if the economy goes south, which sadly it did. So during the Great Recession, sales tax collections cratered. School districts really had no choice but to go back to property owners and seek supplemental levies. That's where you saw the proliferation in supplemental levies after 2006, and a pretty strong correlation between the two events.
Bringing us back to this week's elections and the school districts really struggling to find that money for things like replacing roofs and hiring paraprofessionals.
Right. I mean, we talked about the big ballot questions around school districts on Tuesday, Coeur d'Alene and Valley View and Middleton. But I want to spend a second talking about Three Creek, one of the smallest districts in the state. We both have worked in Twin Falls, so we know that geography. Three Creek is in the middle of nowhere. It is one of the smallest school districts in the state. Its enrollment hovers around the lowest enrollment in the state. I mean, sometimes barely double-digit enrollment in that little tiny district. They had a $40,000 supplemental levy on the ballot. And that sounds like a joke. $40,000 doesn't sound like very much money when we're talking about $1 billion that was on the line during Thursday's session. Well, $40,000 over 2 years pays for a paraprofessional in the classroom in that really small school district. Their supplemental levy passed 13 votes to 3. So, it's not just the big districts with big asks of their voters. It's small districts saying, this is the only place we can get the money. This is the only way we can provide these services. So it's affecting districts of all sizes in all corners of this state.
And until that 2023 legislature comes in, and it's going to be a very different legislature than what we saw on Thursday, who we saw on Thursday, we're not going to know how that money is going to be doled out and whether that's going to relieve any of those stresses that those districts are feeling.
Right. I think that's the open page right now. That's the blank page as we head into this. Where does all of this new money go? And where do you set the priorities? I mean, we've talked about the teacher shortage so much. We've written so much about the teacher shortage, and that's a big deal. We've written about the challenges of hiring classified employees, and that's a real thing. We've talked about the facilities issues are a real thing. So those are going to be certainly some of the topics that we talk about. But I think you're also going to see people saying, hey, wait a minute, is this an opportunity to put money into school choice, to pilot some school choice programs? You will have not only new legislators, but you will have a new superintendent of public instruction, whether that's Debbie Critchfield or Terry Gilbert, who will come at that school choice question quite differently depending on which one of them is elected. That's going to be part of the debate come January as well.
At the end of the day, could this week's education funding component have passed if it weren't linked to the tax cuts?
Probably not. I don't know if any of these component parts would have passed on their own, really. I mean, it was such a weird debate. You observed it, you wrote about it, you tweeted about it, we noted it, and we wrote it in our stories. So many legislators who got up and said, I'm really not wild about this bill, but I'm going to vote for it anyway. Considering how big this bill is, considering how big this law is, and what a huge impact it's going to have on education policy and tax policy for years to come, there was so much buyer's remorse that was expressed on the House floor and the Senate floor that, no, I don't think a $400 million education component would have passed on its own. I don't think those tax components necessarily would have passed on their own, because you would have Democrats saying, oh, again, another round of income tax reductions, and you would have conservatives saying, this is all we can do with a $2 billion surplus. I don't know if, we'll never know for sure, but I'm not convinced that Governor Little could have cobbled together 18 votes in the Senate and 36 in the House for any of these component parts had they been broken up.
Kevin Richert, Idaho Education News, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks.